Great. We will make a start. Welcome, everyone. My name is James Wilsdon, Professor of Research Policy at STEaPP and Director of ARIA, the Research Institute. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you all to the first of this new series of STEaPP seminars with the title of Flashpoints and Fault Lines in Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy, STEaPP. We came up with, we weren't implying any fault lines, obviously, in the unity and coherence of the department, but rather in the world out there and all the debates that on which science, technology, engineering, public policy impinge. So we've got a series of talks and seminars that start today and will run monthly for the next 3 months, and we'll then have a summer break, as is the usual way, and reconvene again for more in the autumn. And we are organising these in part for colleagues within STEaPP, but also importantly for friends and colleagues from across other parts of UCL with an interest in these debates. It's great to see a few colleagues here from STS and IPP and other important nodes of research and policy activity in this space. Our first talk is going to be by Geoff Mulgan, Sir Geoff Mulgan, Professor of Collective Intelligence, Public Policy and Social Innovation at STEaPP. I think probably Geoff needs little introduction to many of us. He's had a long and prestigious career at the heart of public policy making in the UK, including at number 10 years running Nesta, or that the Young Foundation. And he's now co-founder of a new organisation, in addition to his UCL role, called the Institutional Architecture Lab, which Geoff will no doubt tell us about over the course of his talk. But this is all about the topic of today's seminar. Do we need new public institutions for science, technology and innovation? When Geoff's given his talk, we've then got 3 discussants to kick us off with some thoughts. We've got William Cullen Bown, journalist, former owner, editor of Research Fortnight, and now a prolific substacker, among other things, on these topics. We have Anjana Ahuja from the Financial Times, which is fantastic. And we have Ine Steenmans, who's an associate professor in futures analysis and policy within STEaPP. So each of those will just give a few minutes of thoughts, and then we'll have a discussion. And we also have a glass of wine or non-alcoholic alternative at the end. I think downstairs, Leo. Are we in? Yeah, two floors below. Yeah. So there will be drinks afterwards. So we'll aim to wrap up the talking by 5:30, and then have half an hour or so for some drinks and discussion. So welcome, everyone. It's great to have you here, and we look forward, Geoff, to hearing your thoughts.
Well, thank you, James. Thank you all for being here. I feel kind of guilty taking you all away from this gorgeous day outside. And if you change your mind and want to see the film version, you can leave now. We won't be offended. But we've got an amazing group actually in this room, so I'm going to try and I will talk a little bit, but I want to leave plenty of time to hear from all of you, and I'm not going to follow that clock in terms of my timing. And I'm going to share with you what, in a way, is work in progress, so as many questions as answers. And my hope is to encourage some of you perhaps to be part of answering these questions that I'm going to pose. So, how many people recognise this person? One person does. So this is Darren Achimura, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics last year. And he won it for his analysis, which essentially argued that the key explanation of why some countries prospered, were democracies, happy and successful, was the design and the nature of their institutions. It's a whole body of work. It's really impressive. Unfortunately, he only does it retrospectively. But if he's right, the implication is the design of institutions now may be equally important in determining which societies, nations thrive in the 2030s, 40s and 50s, as was the case retrospectively in the past. I tried to persuade him to do some more work on that, but he sticks to his knitting. And particularly, if you also believe other Nobel Prize winners that science, technology and innovation are the key drivers, other key drivers of growth, then it's so logical to think the design of the institutions around science and technology may be absolutely decisive in determining what happens in the next few decades. So that's the starting point. I'm going to do sort of 10 minutes or so each on what I think the problem is, some of the things we can learn from other countries and other sectors, and then some recent work trying to develop design tools, new frameworks, new methods for inventing new institutions. My background, for those of you who don't know, I've worked in governments, so City, UK and Australia, European Commission, run foundations and written books, mainly as a kind of therapeutic exercise. But I've also, as James said, been involved in quite a lot of the different sort of thinking about new ideas about how government should work over quite a few decades, from government as a platform, whole of government strategy, And often I've seen it take at least 10 years for these ideas to become mainstream. This most recent one is the bottom, institutional architecture. I don't think it's immediately going to become obvious why this matters, but I'm fairly confident it will, in time, come to be seen as an obvious common sense. Just as many of these other things, from open data and evidence and so on, became relatively common sense. So that's the premise of what I'm going to talk about. This is a lovely picture. Does anyone recognize where that is from? Reykjavik. So by the, it's the unknown bureaucrat. And it's a kind of symbol of what many people think public institutions can be like. Maybe solid, reliable, but basically unseeing, unknowing, unthinking, unresponsive. And the reason I'm going to use the language of architecture is there's a very famous quote, sometimes attributed to Winston Churchill, that we shape our buildings and then they shape us. And the same, I think, is true of institutions. And in many ways, the institutional design is a little bit like the design of buildings. It's a mixture of, there's some science, there's some engineering, there's some history, there's some aesthetics, there's some context, and they can either be life-enhancing or the opposite. And I think we need a discipline, actually, of institutional architecture, which is largely missing at the moment. So we have some contenders around the world with answers to this question. How many people in this room have read Project 2025? A few have. You're very strange people. It's an extraordinary document, 1,000 pages long, but it does say this. It commits to dismantle the administrative state and return self-governance to the American people and to an 18th century model of minimal government. So it's worth realizing what they're deliberately trying to do is actually to dismantle the state. And they think they're doing pretty well at it. So there's a kind of minimalist approach out there on the other side of the Atlantic. And then there's an almost opposite approach happening in China, which a year and a half ago created the CSTC under the deputy premier to really coordinate centralized control over every aspect of science and technology, as you can see, including education, IP, investments, but also countermeasures against foreign sanctions and security. So it's fascinating. The US and China are going in literally opposite directions. One with a sort of maximalist hyperstate control, one dismantling. And then the other complication in this story is what I call bypass. So this audience will know these facts, but most people find it really surprising to realize that in 1960, the US Pentagon essentially controlled a third of all global R&D. What does it say there? 36%. And now it's about 3%. And that's partly been the rise of China and India and Brazil and Russia, but it's also this massive shift out to the private sector. So Amazon's R&D budget, I think, is about 3 times the UK government budget, something of that kind. We've seen a massive shift of power over tech in a generation or two, which makes the questions I'm going to talk about in some ways more complex. So the issue is really what kind of state, what should the state look like as it tries to perhaps influence some of those companies, to nurture technology, science, startups, all those different things, Are we looking at sort of new kinds of pyramid? Or should our mental metaphors, and I'll talk about this a bit later, be more like myceliums or more like grids and meshes and so on? What's the mental tools for thinking about institutional design? Now, this audience will be very familiar with maps like this, which sort of try to map the UK innovation ecosystem. With universities and businesses, this is a slightly distorted version because it comes from NCUB. And then a whole group of public bodies, DCIT, funding councils, labs, and so on. There's a very striking pattern if you look at the most recent ones. So ARIA, which has just started in the last couple of years, has its gathering, I think, is next week, the catapults, and UKRI. So I don't know if anyone can guess what the common feature of these three new institutions is. Well, I'll tell you, they are all based on incredibly old models. So ARIA was consciously modeled on DARPA, which was a late 50s invention, catapults on Fraunhofer from the 40s, and UKRI, the Research Council model, is essentially 100 years old. Now, that doesn't make them wrong, but it's kind of a bit remarkable that these apparently new creatures were essentially copies of institutions from several generations ago in other countries. And in many cases, other options hadn't really been considered, and there wasn't even a method for considering other options. And we get this very strange pattern in, certainly in national government, but it's also true in Scotland, Wales, and elsewhere, that often these new institutions come out of a committee. The committee does an analysis, it makes a proposal, a law is passed, then a new committee is created, which becomes the board, appoints a chair, appoints a CEO, and then they kind of create an organogram like this. And literally all those institutions I've described, that is their story. Now, again, that's not necessarily a terrible way to do things, but it's not obviously an optimal way to do things. It's a default which has become a habit, in part because it hasn't been questioned. And we have this sort of bizarre history as a result of the lack of a kind of intellectual framework for institutional design of just endless merging and splitting. That is what the UK state does all the time. The big reform a few months ago on the NHS, which was going back to what it had been in 2012, was a merging one. We're talking about lots of mergers of regulators at the moment. And it keeps people very busy, but it's an extraordinarily uncreative way of thinking about organizational design. And yet it's the dominant one in UK policy field at the moment. Either copy a very old model or just merge and split something which already exists. It's a kind of Lego block approach to government. So this becomes the oddness of this becomes much more apparent if you then look at the business world. And all of us every day, use the products of these companies, which are based on completely different organizational principles, based on a platform, search engines, on algorithms like TikTok, or like ARM, extremely complex licensing frameworks. The business world has utterly revolutionized the design of organizations. John Kay's book this year, I strongly recommend, on the corporation in the 21st century, at which point has little questions like, who owns the most aircraft in the world? Does anyone know which company owns the most aircraft? And you won't know because it's a company in Dublin, which no one's heard of. Amazon doesn't own its warehouses. Business has completely revolutionized its organizational forms. And we are now in an era when a majority of the most valuable companies on the planet are based on data or knowledge or platforms. As you can see, Saudi Aramco, the main exception. Whereas in government, data knowledge-based institutions are usually tiny little units or teams. All the power is still in finance, mainly. Ministries of finance and treasurers, which hasn't been true in business for at least half a century. So there's a striking contrast there. If you look at civil society, there's also been a lot of innovation, collective intelligence, things like Wikipedia. I think there's 20,000 DAOs or so in the world, decentralized autonomous organizations on blockchain. There's these new legal forms like B Corps. There's things like our friends at King's, you know, on citizen science projects like Zoe, and Archive, which probably many of you use all the time. Again, a remarkable kind of non-profit invention in the world of science. Again, these look nothing like those public bodies with their committees that I talked about earlier. Across the world, there are some exceptions of more radical innovation in institutional forms. India is probably the main example at the moment, partly thanks to ADA, UID, and all that happened there, which has then had spin-offs like this one, the Open Network for Digital Commerce, which is a government meta platform which overlays all the other platforms like Grab and Uber and so on. Probably politically inconceivable in Europe, but a very interesting attempt by government to completely rethink the institutional forms of how do you deliver cheap goods and services to citizens. Estonia's X-Road, again, an integrated digital system which links all the government departments, but also much of business, the utilities and banks, and is now, I think, copied in about 20 other countries. Again, that was a very creative new way of thinking about government. There are our friends in the UAE have odd things like their Ministry of Possibilities, which isn't really a Ministry of Possibilities, but at least it's trying to think creatively about the forms of government. And others like in Singapore, who have a very good, one of the few really systematic initiatives around skills and the future. And the one sort of UK exception is hardly talked about in London. So Wales 10 years ago created the world's first Future Generations Commissioner to represent the interest of future generations in today's problems, copied by the European Commission a few months ago. And that definitely is an innovative new institution of government, but as I say, not talked about at all in the Whitehall context. And in a way, these are exceptions. I share these public sector ones because there's far less of this creative innovation in the public sector than in business and civil society in recent years. So what might the implications for science and technology be? And are our current institutions here fit for purpose? Well, I would argue they're not, and you will all have your own sort of story of what the big problems or issues might be, but I'll just share 4 or 5 of them. I think the most basic, obvious one is, what does the UK do in a world of much more intense geopolitical conflict, trade wars, tech wars, and so on? Do we have any institutions capable of working out what to do? I don't think we do. And there was none designed for this era, which is very different from 6 months ago. We have all sorts of challenges around trust in science. This is a slightly unfair to put the New York Post attacking Anthony Fauci there, but in a way this is a symptom of an era of much more aggressive skepticism of science. And one of the reasons Trump is doing what he's doing is the dramatic decline of trust in science among Republican voters in the last 10 years. It hasn't quite hit the UK yet, but I think it could do. Last year, CASE did a very interesting study of public attitudes to R&D, which showed that only 9% of the British public think publicly funded R&D benefits them a lot. And almost no one knew about R&D in their own areas. So I think there's quite a big legitimation problem of science and tech, which again is very rarely talked about by the peak institutions because they think it's obvious they're doing a good job, they're virtuous. What's the problem? But it could become a problem quite quickly. And then there's the long-run challenge of Eroom's law, the slowdown of R&D productivity. Again, this audience probably is familiar with this, but most very well-informed people are completely unaware of these trends, that while digital productivity has been going like that since the mid-60s, the productivity of pharmaceuticals R&D has been in a remarkable long-term decline. And John Van Riemen, who chairs Rachel Reeves' advisory committee, did a fantastic report a couple of years ago showing this is true of many other sectors as well. So there's a bit of a problem here. And again, do we hear any of our peak institutions even talking about it, let alone having ways of solving these problems? I don't think we do. So I'm going to briefly share a few examples of some global institutions which at least we should be aware of and could be relevant to our task before suggesting some design options. So this is a slightly random list, but they're some of the ones I find interesting and relevant to us. So the first are the government guidance funds. So China in the last 20 years has created over 1,500 of these. And they've deployed, the estimates vary, but between $1 and $1.5 trillion. Absolutely extraordinary scale of investment in the tech development stage. So not basic science, this is in tech. There are ones like the China Internet Investment Fund. There was another one announced only a couple of months ago, I think. And you can argue about are they good or they're bad. They've lost quite a lot of money. They've got some things wrong, but they've been part of the extraordinary story of Chinese technological prowess and overtaking the US in many fields. At the very least, we should be learning from them. Since the tech stage, the tech development stage has always been a big problem for the UK. Germany has been working on a new agency for tech adoption, another absolutely obvious priority for the UK, given low productivity in so much of our economy. We always thought Germany was good at this, and it's ironic that Germany is creating a new institution for adoption and the UK has a review, which still hasn't reported in classic sense. So again, there's a sort of institutional gap there we should be thinking about. There are more systems approaches. Last year I did a project for the European Commission on whole of government innovation. Some very interesting approaches from the Netherlands' top sector approach to Sweden's Vinnova, we'll actually visit next week, attempting to think about whole systems rather than just traditional funding. Again, we have no institutions capable of doing that sort of work or even thinking like that in the UK at the moment. AI regulators. The UK has decided not to have an AI regulator. I suspect that will look like a mistake. Again, China sort of got there 12 years ago with the Cyberspace Administration, which regulates the internet in very particular ways, as well as a very, very detailed regulation of AI. And Europe's countries are beginning to create regulators like ARIA in Spain was the first one. And it's a difficult task. What should these look like? How should they work? And so on. But it's hard to believe that in 5 years' time, the UK will still not have any kind of regulatory capacity on AI. I think we will need a lot on strategic procurement. Defense will be the most obvious field, but also in health. And one of my colleagues, Leo Quattrucci, a couple of months ago, we published through TIAL a set of proposals on changing public procurement, mainly of AI, in the age of AI. And again, there is no institutional locus for this in the UK state, which makes it very fair game or easy for the big vendors to take advantage. Around the world, there are lots of institutions for social innovation. The Malaysian science minister was here a couple of weeks ago, and this was one of the main things they wanted to talk about. And this is one of the institutions under the Ministry of Science and Technology. There's literally nothing now in the UK at a government level on social innovation. It's completely been squeezed out of the DCIT story. And say globally, that makes us quite unusual. Everywhere from Brazil to India to Canada to Sweden to Finland, this is a top priority. Citra, the main innovation agency in Finland, is completely reorienting around social innovation now. There's an institutional gap at the city level. At one point, London had quite a good structure, trying to link the different tiers of government and universities to orchestrate research and knowledge around the problems of the city. That was dismantled. Amsterdam is now, I think, quite a good example of something like that, set up by their chief scientist, the city with the chief scientist, who created this structure which links lots of researchers, lots of officials, lots of civil society groups on problem-solving processes. We don't have anything like that in any of our big cities in the UK. And there's a trend, an interesting trend of innovation agencies moving from being funders to actually creating product. A2I in Bangladesh was one of the best examples, part of the Prime Minister's office in the Bangladeshi government, but it created tools. And there's a little bit of that in the UK government. So IAI, the incubator for AI, we had Laura Gilbert, who set it up here a few weeks ago, I think is a good example. But again, it's a bit of an exception of actual product creation rather than, as I say, just funding. And finally, there's a whole story about new global science observatories. We've had IPCC, we had IPBES on biodiversity, and a very live debate at the moment around chemicals and plastics. We published 2 years ago proposals on an observatory for AI, but there are lots of obvious institutional gaps at a global level for new kinds of observatories to at least provide the information, as IPCC did, which can then be used for action. So those are just a few examples of what's happening around the world. The surprising thing, which over the last 2 years I've been around asking questions of lots of people and places, and the simple question is, where is there the knowledge? Where's the expertise on how to do this? In the UK government, there is none, but there isn't either actually in universities here or elsewhere. The consultancies just recycle very old stuff. Big philanthropy hasn't actually shown much interest in this at all. And so I think it's a bit of a strange gap, especially the year after the Nobel Prize for Economics was awarded for institutional design being the critical question, that there is neither the practitioner knowledge or the research knowledge to guide it. So what I've been doing in the last year or so with a few colleagues scattered around the world, it's a very small initiative. We called it the Institutional Architecture Lab. We're based in Finland, India, Brazil, here, South Africa. We just wanted to create something to work on beginning to fill this space. And I'll give you a very little flavor of that before we get the responses. At the end of March, we held an event with the UNDP in Istanbul, showcasing a lot of examples and methods, and also publishing a kind of playbook on how to do this work with the different stages of institutional design. And a kind of AI-powered version of that goes live, is live, but goes really live very shortly. And we looked at quite a few interesting examples, some of which I've mentioned. They range from things like chief heat officers in cities, new agencies for care, Icarus, this extraordinary collective intelligence project of the world's animals and birds, data governance, Maori data governance, Rwanda Space Agency. We were trying to create a repertoire of examples, and we found most people unaware of these. There's not common knowledge about these innovative examples. And then the aim was to help governments think more creatively about their options. As I said, there is this traditional method of a committee, a law, another committee, chief exec, and this is the default in much of the world. But there are very different ways you can do things tactically. The simplest one is to do what happens in venture capital or in social enterprise and other fields, which is you do things through learning by doing in stages. You set up a team, you test out your ideas, you get some initial objectives, you prove you can work, and then you steadily grow and you grow and grow. And maybe the law, the statutory structure comes at the end of that process, not at the beginning. Now that's not right for everything, but it's often a much better way of doing things than the legal pyramid model. And then we've tried to suggest a repertoire which goes beyond the traditional options of ministries, agencies, regulators, commissions, special purpose vehicles, and so on. And I'll give a very quick flavor of these. So I think the most important one is the one I mentioned before, is the idea that perhaps in 10 years' time, it will be obvious that the key institutions in any government will, as in business, be based on intelligence, knowledge, data, evidence, not on finance. And there are some good precursors of that. more than 25 years since the UK created NICE, National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, which is a rare example of a strong intelligence-based institution. It's got its own problems, but in a way, it partly drives the financial allocations in the NHS by assessing value for money of treatments, drugs, etc. New Zealand has the integrated data infrastructure, which I think is the best example of a multiple data sets linked together. And this was the creation of Peter Gluckman, the former chief scientist in New Zealand, still not copied yet here or elsewhere. Maybe it's easier in New Zealand, it's quite small, but it's an extraordinary tool for understanding phenomena and in very sophisticated ways. And the best example we found in our work with the UNDP was a slightly different kind of intelligence organization, the International Solar Alliance, which now works in 80 countries on solar implementation. And it's unusual because it's an intelligence assembly and orchestrator, not like the IPCC for analyzing the problem, but for the solutions. So it gathers data and evidence, it does training for anything to do with solar implementation in the global south. And once you look at ISA, you think, well, why do we have nothing like that for our care system? Why do we have nothing like that for all the things which matter in a country like this? So that's one set of institutions. The next set, which I think are strangely missing despite our history, are institutions to help navigate complex science and technology. So in the early 90s, the UK set up the HFEA, which was designed after an enormous public debate and parliamentary debate to help us navigate all the difficult dilemmas around IVF and cloning and so on. And in many ways has worked very well to both keep the public on side and engaged, but also to allow a lot of pretty radical science to be done. In a way, it's extraordinary. Nothing like that was created for the internet or for AI. And you could say some of the things which have gone wrong perhaps wouldn't have gone so badly wrong if we'd had something like that. And looking shortly ahead, I think the big question for many countries will be what to do about quantum. Who and how do you discuss the trade-offs of the advantages, the risks, the privacy concerns, and so on? That's the one based in CERN under JESDA, the Open Quantum Institute, but there are still no public bodies focused on this kind of steering. A lot of our work is focused on what we call mesh institutions. So on many of these topics, you now need institutions which link multiple tiers of government, sort of the verticals, but also sometimes horizontally. And a few months ago, we did work on like the UK innovation districts, and that's a classic example. There's probably a need for some kind of mesh institution so they can share knowledge and methods, but also quickly access power at a national level, perhaps to enable a new inward investor to come in, or again, for things like tech adoption. We've looked a lot at stack-based institutions. So the India stack has had a huge impact in the last 10 years. Europe is now talking about the Euro stack as its copy of that. And once you think in stack terms, actually, this is a way of designing very different institutions from the classic pyramids. Again, if we had time, I'd go in more detail, but it's a different mental model of how to design things. And the same is true of protocol-based institutions. The internet is a protocol-based institution. And there's a lot of work being done in energy and other fields on how you might do that. So you create a light touch institution, but with a whole series of principles on APIs, interoperability, and so on. And this is Beacon, which is one of the models for doing this. I think this may even be usable in many public services as well. We found the most useful metaphor for helping civil servants and otherwise others think creatively is myceliums, mushrooms. Because once you start thinking, let's not create a pyramid, let's create a mycelium, it opens up all sorts of ways of thinking about how you loosely connect multiple things. Myceliums are the biggest living organisms on the planet. They have a very different above the ground and below the ground characteristics, and they're hyper resilient. And Buurtzorg in the Netherlands, which is the care organization, about 20,000 people, is quite consciously designed on mycelium. Well, they call themselves an onion, but in reality, it's a mycelium organizing model. And then finally, there's kind of, in a way, the opposite, but which is, you could call the sort of superpower agency model, whose paradigm was in the Second World War when Knudsen was sort of put in charge of completely transforming American industry for the war effort. And he, built millions of, aircraft, tanks, and so on with extraordinary success. And you could say what happened in India, which I've mentioned a few times around UID with Nandan Nilekani, was a bit like that, where you create an arm's length body, half inside the bureaucracy, half with a new way of working, in order to carry out a really difficult, complex project. You don't create a committee. You don't encourage them to do a review. You focus on action. And in the case of both of them, a sort of stage gate action with rapid learning rather than focusing on laws. So that's all just to give a flavor of some of the different ways of thinking about institutional design. There are as much questions as answers. This is the thing, Co-Innovator, which we've launched. And I should probably mention this one I did with STEaPP PhD student Alish Kapp back in February, which was one example of trying to design a prototype. In this case, it wasn't for science and technology, but for defending elections from deepfakes and synthetic content. And we did a kind of blueprint of what we thought pretty much every country needed, a capability to mobilize both collective intelligence and AI to very rapidly spot a deep fake and get it off the internet so it wouldn't wreck an election. But in a way, what I'm hoping we can do much more of is things like that, which are specific designs. They're not just diagnoses of problems, but they're proposals for solutions. So to go back to Darren Etchemullen, is he right? I mean, what I hope we might discuss is, is he right that institutions are a fundamental cause of long-run growth, freedom, democracy? If he is right, then at least some of what I'm talking about should matter. If he's wrong, fine. Maybe something else is the key. And in a way, the most basic question is, should our institutions, our UKRIs, our catapults, and so on, is it okay that in 2030 they still look pretty much the same as in 1990 or 1960? And I think since we're having this discussion in university, what is their role? Should they be playing any role, not just in analysing perhaps the mistakes or successes of the past, but actually in the practice and theory of architecture? And we have here in the UCL the Bartlett School, which does a fantastic job on the architecture of buildings. Why is it inconceivable we should have something similar for the architecture of institutions? Hey, I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much. I was putting the mic back. I will resist the temptation to fire in with questions of my own and instead invite the first of our discussants up to give some thoughts. We've asked each of these to do so 3, 4, 5 minutes max. William, to just sort of kick off the discussion, because we've got lots of other expertise in the room as well. It'd be great to hear from others here. So, William, I'm going to hand you this.
Right, thank you. It's really so interesting. Thinking about the question posed here, the answer you got sort of really from Geoff was sort of yes for Acemoglu, sort of institutional design type reasons, and my answer would be yes, but for political reasons. It is something like 4 years since Keir Starmer started talking about mission-led government, committed to an industrial strategy. And, in doing so, he started to sketch out a quite different role for the state, a new responsibility for the state that hasn't been embraced by Britain for 40, arguably 50 years, right? And in that new kind of world that Starmer is sketched out a long time ago now, science and innovation starts to be something quite different, certainly for government. I mean, in the whole of my working life, you know, it's been really an end in itself, essentially. But if you've got an industrial strategy, if you've really seriously got an industrial strategy, then it is a servant of the industrial strategy, right? And because all of that kind of big framework of what the government is trying to do is changing, and is changing from what we've had for a very, very long time, then it just seems to be obvious. Yes, we need new institutions, right? Because we're going to be doing new things. So this discussion that we're having here, this seminar, seems to be very welcome, but at the same time, 4 years late. I mean, you know, that's not your fault, but like, how is it that the UK as a whole didn't get on to discussing this a long time ago? And I think there are two answers to that. One is that there are some people who just don't agree with this new agenda, who don't want to see it happen, right? And you could say, broadly speaking, the most obvious representatives of that are Tony Blair, William Hague, who drafted a new national purpose, and their ally Larry Ellison, and their other allies, the outgoing and incoming presidents of the Royal Society, right? And they are all people who are signed up to the kind of science superpower approach to science that we've had in this country for 40 years. So, okay, it's fine. They're against it. Okay, that's fine. But then there's, I think, a second group of people, a much larger range of people who aren't against it, aren't particularly for it, rather just haven't really got the intellectual machinery for thinking about this. Because as a country, we just haven't been doing it for, you know, so long that we've lost the concepts and the habit of thinking about what's involved for this kind of hands-on as opposed to hands-off approach to supporting industry. And I think, you know, 4 years is enough now. So I think we have to kind of get with it and get involved in thinking about what's involved if we're going to be hands-on instead of hands-off. And I think Geoff has done an amazingly good job at sketching out the kind of issues that start to come up and the kind of possibilities that are involved in the really wide range of things that have to be taken on board, and the necessity for a kind of evolutionary kind of approach to this, as opposed to, yeah, a kind of committee defining something that gets legislated for and then kind of gets imposed. It's such a big challenge that it's going to have to be evolutionary. And I think we just need to get on with it. And I would just say that one last thing. I mean, you mentioned NICE as a paradigm for one of these kinds of institutions. And, you know, I would say, you know, NICE was set up by Frank Dobson. Frank Dobson was Keir Starmer's political godfather and is like the most obvious precursor for Starmerism, right? So that's seems like, you know, a good starting point for the kind of institutions that will make sense for the government that we've got. Thank you.
Likewise, for me, I don't know about you, but people often say, wow, what a rich talk and provocative. It's just a challenge to keep up in a really positive way. I might just hold it like this. There we go. So broadly, I would describe as someone, so I work at STEaPP as an academic, and broadly I work is someone who works to bridge the work of academia and policy. And my specific kinds of questions that I actually want to bring and make some connection to here with what Geoff raised are questions nowadays around what are the skills that public servants need? What do our civil servants need to be able to do in order to be able to solve societal problems? And so one of the things that has really struck me about Geoff's talk is a question around, it's not just that we need institutions that are oriented to solve society's problem, it's that their design will fundamentally be a core causal variable that will determine whether or not those institutions are capable of driving change. From my day-to-day where I sit at the moment, there's a huge amount of enthusiasm in terms of what will leaders in the civil service and our government, so I'm taking a very public institutions perspective here. What are the skills that these individuals will need to drive missions change, missions leadership? And a lot of the emphasis of responses being, well, we just need to equip them to be able to just reach out for lots of information, which we heard from Geoff's talk. So can we really do this? I can't remember what you called it, but sort of the radiant information individual within an information radiant institution. And then once equipped with that information, they'll be able to act. But there's a complete disconnect that if the institution isn't set up structurally to allow that person to act, they just won't be able to live up to that expectation. And so for me, this design-based entry point, challenging this question that just because we have increasing access into information, we won't necessarily see the action that we need. And when we look at any area like climate action, pandemic responses, regulation of technology, when Geoff gave an amazing amount of examples, we can see sort of the limitations. So that was my first part that sort of, I really feel, not only hear the echoes, but I feel like I have a new way of framing the kind of challenge and limitations really to the current approach the civil service is taking to questions around how to be more productive and change oriented. And my other next part here, so most of my work is on analysis, so I'm a methods professor, a methods researcher. And Geoff's image of the Lego blocks, this question around what's our approach to thinking about appropriate institutional structures that are going to let us have better analysis for societal response. We either reuse something that existed or we sort of, what do you call it, break apart, fragment, or reconsolidate. In an area where I used to work a lot more in futures, a lot of these questions around appropriate institutional design for analysis, they're far more ad hoc and accidental than you'd even imagine, or definitely than is comfortable. There is very little intentional design that really says about what is it that makes an institution equipped to think analytically about the future and turn that into something actionable. The example Geoff gave of in New Zealand, the integrated data infrastructure, is I think currently the kind of imagery that is the strongest. When people try to imagine what is sort of our next wave or generation of science futures organizations, well, we will have greater databases that are more and more interoperable and linked, and they will give us more and more information so we can scan for the things that are emerging. The limitation there still is that it makes this assumption that just getting the information synthesized into the right places, into a singular institution, we will be able to act. And so it doesn't really have that cross-institutional view of how you need, like there's an architecture for how different institutions, different meshes really will connect to allow that action to happen. I think where I see at the moment, the thing that like gives me greatest hope, I hope not naive hope, is that especially in the evaluation space, so this is very UK specific, but in the evaluation community, so it's sort of greater move towards being more accountable for how we spend public money, and then are able to demonstrate the evidence for the kinds of benefit that that generates for the public. It's an evaluation really that a lot of these questions, and I think that's sort of a really ripe space, like really are beginning to come up. It's not one institution that will hold responsibility for evaluation. Rather, it is a connective tissue across lots of different public activities, uses of public resources. And so there, I think the kind of shift currently in ethos of building meshes so we can share data information and sense making about what is the nature of a particular policy? Why do we think it works, or do we expect it to work in certain ways? And how do we share that kind of sense making across institutional boundaries? That for me is one example where I try to think like, where am I seeing some of this kind of meshed-like behavior? It happens in really informal spaces, whether that's conferences, coffees, people meeting for sort of meaning making about models in a really informal way. But that it's not formal, but that for me in a public sector in the UK has been one of the most sort of fruitful spaces. And then lastly, I'm left with lots of questions. You know, I think questions around accountability. So I try to imagine if I see in this analysis within UK government space as a move towards more micellar, or is that the right phrase? That's the makeup for my ceiling. My ceiling, and mesh structures, then I just think about how do we remain accountable? Like which way does the accountability flow and who will do it for what? And the kind of equivalent I could draw on, and I don't know what you think about this, Geoff, is what we do as researchers at a university. The sort of practical response is you have to be transparent about your analytical process, not about your results, but about how you work and how you arrive at conclusions. So in terms of institutional governance and STI institutional governance, it's more than cultural. It's a really strong norm that transparency about your process is the only way to kind of build up accountability. And then I think sort of the question there that I will leave for you is that probably is super naive, you know, who is at risk, who could potentially be harmed if we move towards some kind of greater non-pyramidal, greatly centralized coordination public approach to STI funding. I'm going to leave it there, but thank you so much.
Brilliant, thank you. Particularly that last point about methodological robustness and transparency.
Right, hello, I'm Anjana Ahuja. I'm a science commentator at the FT, and I'm very much coming at this from a science point of view. And I don't really have any institutional knowledge or anything like that, but there are certainly some things I'd like to come back for, and to thank you all for inviting me, and nice to follow my two speakers. So first of all, I want to go back to something that you said, Geoff, which was, are institutions fit for purpose? And we're talking about STI, science, technology, innovation, research, and that kind of thing. And I want to take it back a bit, because I think what we need to ask is what their purpose is. And I think that's I think before you do anything, I think that's really super fundamental. So when we talk about research and science and innovation and technology, are we talking about it, as you seem to be, as an engine of economic growth, which, you know, that's obviously that's what governments see it as, that's what lots of policy people see it as, although not all. I'm not sure the public often sees it that way. Is it for, instead, is the purpose of these institutions to, as Ine said, solve societal challenges or problems, you know, to serve the public good in some way? Or is it to, as William said, is it to expand the canon of human knowledge? So I think there's an element of thinking that perhaps form follows function. You decide what the purpose of these institutions is first, or what your end goal is if you're thinking, you know, sort of a bit more nebulously rather than actually a specific institution. And I want to quote a real world example, because, for example, the Turing Institute, there was a piece in the Financial Times this month about their chief executive saying that actually, you know, the Alan Turing Institute was founded as a kind of data governance institute, and in the time of David Cameron. And actually a lot of that work is going on in companies, and there seemed to be some disquiet about the mismatch between what the Turing Institute was trying to do in terms of kind of laying out how it should be governed, and what the companies were doing anyway. And their chief executive said in the FT that they're now looking to make a strategic shift to a more focused agenda on a smaller number of problems that have real world impact. That was a really neat phrase that encapsulated four things. There was kind of strategic thinking needed about what they were about. They needed to focus on that, sort of drill down. They needed to shrink what they worked on, and also concentrate on how that would have impact in the real world. So that's one thing. And I think that the interesting thing about that is that a lot of the AI research is going on in companies, and it's behind closed doors. So that's the proprietary aspect, and that worries me a little bit because of how people can sort of buy into what's going on, what's the governance. Which brings me to the next issue, which I think is, what is the role of expertise in an age of populism? And so what kind of societies are these institutions going to be embedded in? And what is the social contract, if you like, between the people and the people who run the institutions who fund them. So again, I was quite interested in ARIA, as you quite rightly pointed out. It's such an old kind of organisation, like the DARPA model. And it's trying to do good things. So, for example, last week you may have read about the solar engineering work that it's funding, but also will have seen the headlines to do with that, which is that a lot of the public are very alarmed at what ARIA is funding. And so there's this element of wanting to have flexible institutions, but is there a trade-off between flexibility and governance, which I think needs to be thought about. I, like you, Geoff, I was absolutely fascinated when I came across the Future Generations Commissioner in Wales. Such an interesting idea. And I think one of the most interesting things about that is that it put future generations on the map. And it got that idea out into the public where it can be talked about and discussed, and it almost kind of legitimizes it as a subject. I'm just going to quickly say what did strike me. I'm sure it will come out in the conversation. But I love NICE. I love HFEA. When it comes to the superpower agencies, again, as just somebody who commentates, I wonder about the public buy-in for that because of who holds the power. You know, these are governments that are running things, but they are running it on behalf of the people. And I just want to have a shout out in terms of social innovation for the What Works centres, which are excellent. So with that, thank you.
Thanks, Anjana, very much. That was great. Geoff, do you want to just respond very quickly to anything that struck you, particularly from the three discussants, and then we will turn the camera off, and we can put the microphones down, and we can let rip and have a discussion.
Well, thank you. Great comments. I won't speak for long. On Future Generations Commission, as TIAL, we actually published last July a paper looking at all the future generation stuff around the world. And the week after that, Ursula von der Leyen announced that Europe would have one, which obviously wasn't our result of our action, but I like to think it was. And it is a fascinating movement of methods, of institutions, of new ways of thinking. And it's actually not future generations. A child born today who will live to 100. It's, you know, it's just having long-term perspectives in an era of much longer lives just should be obvious. I should emphasize, I'm not an instrumentalist. I don't think all of these institutions should be economically focused, solving problems. I believe there's a big space for purely speculative, open-ended discovery research. And those need, exactly as you said, if that is the purpose, they need institutions fit for that purpose. And probably I should have made that clear. I was focusing on just a range of tasks which are slightly different in nature. And I think the questions Ine raised, I think are really good ones about how do you handle accountability in much more distributed, decentralized ways. There's a kind of old-fashioned view. On Monday we'll be with Citra, the Finnish Future 8 Foundation with a 800 million endowment for a country of 5 million. It's quite a lot of money. But they were invented in the 60s deliberately to reinvent themselves every few years. But they have people from Parliament on their board. So they actually have quite formal accountability, but then this ability to mutate, which I think is an interesting hybrid. And probably many of the good answers to your question will be a mixture of things like the transparency you mentioned and some periodic kind of accountabilities, but not an assumption that a board, a committee reporting to Parliament gives you the reality of accountability to citizens. William's absolutely right on the broader politics. Maybe we'll come on to this in the discussion. Just one last little point. Last year, I published some proposals on how to reinvent the National School of Government, which was dismantled 12, 13 years ago. And I think pretty much everyone thinks the dismantling of it was a mistake. It's led to a dramatic decline of capability in the British civil service. There is a bid in the spending review for creating something new, but it should be created on an entirely new basis. And one of its tasks will be to answer some of the questions you were raising about what skills you actually need in the late 2020s, which are different from in 2010. But again, that's another topic.